The fire was almost gone. Selene Marrow sat on the dirt floor of a cabin that had no right to still be standing, watching the last 3 pieces of wood she owned burn down to nothing. Outside, the wind off the Montana highlands was doing what Montana wind always did in December. It came for everything without apology, worming through every crack in the log walls, lifting the edges of the oilcloth she'd nailed over the broken window 2 months ago. The oilcloth had started to pull loose at the top left corner again. She could hear it flapping, a soft, rhythmic sound, almost like someone knocking. She kept waiting for it to tear completely free. She didn't get up to fix it. She didn't have the energy. Behind her, in the single room that served as bedroom and kitchen and living space for 5 human beings, her children were asleep in a pile beneath every blanket she owned. Cora, who was 7, had her thumb in her mouth again, a habit she'd broken 2 years ago, before Selene's husband Thomas died, before the drought turned their wheat field into a graveyard of yellow stalks, before everything. The twins, Eli and Sam, 8 years old and usually impossible to keep still, lay motionless and pressed together for warmth. And then there was Luca, her eldest at 12, who had insisted on sleeping nearest the wall because he'd decided at some point in the last 6 months that it was his job to be between his siblings and the cold. 12 years old, and he slept like a man standing watch. Selene looked at them for a long moment. Then she looked back at the fire. She had done the calculation so many times that they'd worn grooves in her mind. Half a sack of flour, a jar of salt pork that smelled wrong when she'd opened it last night. Wrong enough that she'd sealed it back up and put it outside in the snow rather than risk it. 8 potatoes, 2 of them already soft. A small tin of coffee she'd been rationing since October. That was what stood between her family and nothing. It was Christmas Day. She hadn't told the children. She'd come to Montana 8 years ago from a small village in the Carpathian region of Eastern Europe, following Thomas Marrow, who had come first and written her letters full of land and possibility. She'd believed those letters. She had been young enough and in love enough to believe them without reservation, packing everything she owned into 2 trunks and crossing an ocean to find a man she'd loved since childhood standing at the dock in New York, grinning like he'd discovered gold. Thomas had been good at grinning. He'd been less good at farming. The land in the Dalton settlement, a small community of homesteaders 40 miles from the nearest town of any size, had been harder than the letters described. The soil was shallow and rocky in places, and what wasn't rocky was prone to flooding in spring and cracking to powder in drought. Thomas had struggled from the beginning, always one season behind, always optimistic about next year. Selene had learned to stretch flour and preserve everything. She'd learned English from a neighbor woman named Hattie Clausen, who'd been kind in the early years and had since died. She'd raised 4 children in a cabin Thomas had built with his own hands. Badly, it turned out, but with love. Thomas died in the spring 3 years ago. A fever that started as a cough and became something that no amount of effort or remedy could stop. He was gone in 12 days. After that, everything was just harder math. The settlement's attitude toward Selene had shifted after Thomas died, in ways she'd felt before she fully understood. People had been distant before. She had an accent. She observed different customs. She was quieter than the other women and less willing to perform the particular kind of sociability that small, isolated communities seemed to require for acceptance. But with Thomas alive, she'd been tolerated. Part of a family unit that fit into a recognizable category. A wife. A mother. Acceptable. Without Thomas, she was something else. A widow with 4 children and no man attached to her. Foreign. Strange. A problem that nobody wanted to claim responsibility for. The Clausens, after Hattie died, had grown colder. The Bourgettes, who ran the small general store that served as the settlement's social center, had twice this past year declined to extend her credit. The settlement's informal women's group, which planned communal events and quietly decided who was deserving of charity and who was not, had never once included Selene in their meetings. She'd known this. She'd chosen not to think about it too hard. But this winter, with the drought having destroyed her crop entirely and the salt pork going bad and the fire dying, she was thinking about it now. She was thinking about all of it. The first log burned through and collapsed into coals around 2 in the morning. Selene fed the second one in carefully, like it was something precious. She supposed it was. She was keeping herself awake deliberately because she wanted to be the one watching the fire and not one of the children. It was a foolish kind of pride. The fire would die the same whether she watched it or slept. But she couldn't bring herself to go to sleep. Sleeping felt too much like giving up. She was still awake an hour later when she heard the sound. At first she thought it was the wind changing. The Highland wind had 100 different voices, and she'd learned most of them over 8 years. The flat, steady moan of an approaching blizzard, the high whistling shriek that came when it forced itself between the mountains, the low rolling sound that preceded a temperature drop. This was none of those. This was a rhythmic crunching, heavy and deliberate. Footsteps in snow. Selene was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. She crossed the room and lifted the oilcloth aside with one hand, pressing her face close to the gap where the window had been. The cold hit her cheek like a slap. Outside, through the curtain of blowing snow, she could see the outline of something at the edge of her property. A wagon, she realized slowly. A large one, with a canvas cover, and 2 horses that stood steaming and patient in the cold. And a figure, tall and dark against the white landscape, walking toward her cabin with slow, unhurried steps. Selene let the oilcloth fall and stepped back. Her first instinct was fear. A lone visitor in a blizzard, in the middle of the night, on Christmas. Nothing about that configuration was comfortable. She looked around the room for anything useful, found Thomas's old skinning knife on the shelf near the door, and picked it up. Then she stood near the door and waited. The footsteps stopped outside. A knock. 3 of them, solid and measured. "Mrs. Marrow." The voice was low, male. She didn't recognize it immediately. "Mrs. Marrow, I know it's the middle of the night. I'm not here to cause you trouble. Name's Garrick Boone. I've got supplies in the wagon, and I'd like to bring them in if you'll let me." Selene stood very still. She knew the name. Everyone in the settlement knew the name. Garrick Boone owned the largest cattle operation in the valley, a sprawling ranch that he ran alone with a rotating crew of cowhands, none of whom stayed long enough to be called permanent. He was a hard man with a reputation for silence and a face that people described differently depending on whether they liked him or feared him. She'd seen him twice at the general store, exchanging brief words with Owen Bourget, and both times he'd nodded at her in passing with the kind of minimal acknowledgement that meant he'd noticed her without staring. She'd thought nothing of it at the time. "Why?" she said through the door. A pause. Then, "Because it's cold and your children are hungry. That's all." Selene looked at the dying fire. She looked at the knife in her hand. She thought about the salt pork outside in the snow and the 8 potatoes and the half sack of flour. She opened the door. Garrick Boone was taller than she'd remembered. He stood in her doorway with snow on his shoulders and his hat, and a look on his face that was careful and neutral. Not warm, exactly, but not threatening. He was perhaps 40, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes that were a particular shade of dark brown that made it difficult to read what was behind them. His coat was heavy canvas, frost stiffened at the collar. His hands were bare despite the cold, and red at the knuckles. He looked at her, then at the knife in her hand, then back at her face. "Smart," he said about the knife. "What do you want?" Selene said. She hadn't stepped back from the door. She wanted to see how he handled that. "I want to unload the wagon," he said. "I've got meat, flour, 2 sacks, rice, firewood, enough to last you a week at least if you're careful, candles. I've also got a tin of something for the children, sugar candy, I suppose, though I don't know if they eat that." Selene stared at him. "You don't know me," she said. "I know who you are," he said. "I know what's happened this year with your crop. I know the Bourgets cut off your credit." He paused. "I know it's Christmas and it's 20 degrees and that cabin is letting in enough wind to fly a kite." "Why do you know all that?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past her briefly into the room where the children slept. Just a glance, not intrusive, more like he was confirming something he'd already known. "Because I pay attention," he said finally. "And because nobody else is out here tonight." The last sentence landed somewhere in Selene's chest in a way she didn't fully understand. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't comfortable because it was true, and because it came from a stranger, and because she'd spent 3 years telling herself she didn't need anyone to notice. She stepped aside. "Don't wake the children," she said. He made 4 trips to the wagon and back in the dark. Selene stood near the fireplace and watched him work, which felt wrong. She didn't like standing still while someone else did labor in her home, but she couldn't quite make herself move. There was something disorienting about the whole situation that she hadn't processed yet. Every time he came back through the door, he brought something. The 2 sacks of flour went against the far wall. The meat, wrapped in cloth and still cold from the wagon, was a haunch of elk, she realized. More meat than she'd seen in one place since the previous winter. The firewood he stacked near the fireplace without being asked to, each piece placed with the kind of careful economy that told her he wasn't new to the work. He built the fire back up without asking if he could do that either. He just did it. He found the right-sized pieces and arranged them the way she'd seen old men arrange fires. Not in a pile, but in a structure, so the air could move through them. Within 10 minutes, the cabin was warmer than it had been in 2 weeks. He stood and looked at the fireplace for a moment, then looked at the wall to his right. "That log's rotting," he said. "I know," she said. "You've got a gap between it and the one above it. That's where most of your cold is coming from on the north side." "I know," she said again. He didn't say anything more about it. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table and turned toward the door. "Wait," Selene said. He turned back. "Why?" she said. She'd asked it before, through the door, and he'd given her a partial answer. She wanted the rest of it. Garrick Boone looked at her for a moment with those unreadable dark eyes. Then he looked at the fire. "My mother was a widow," he said. "She had 2 boys and a cattle operation she didn't know how to run, and a town that was more interested in what she should do next than in helping her do it." He put his hat on. "She managed fine in the end, but I've always thought about the winter she almost didn't." He went to the door and opened it, and the cold came back in. "I'll be by in the morning," he said, "to look at that wall if you'll let me." And then he was gone, and the wagon wheels were crunching away through the snow, and Selene Marrow stood in her suddenly warm cabin with flour and meat and firewood stacked against the walls, holding a knife she no longer needed, and felt something crack open in her chest that she could not immediately name. Numb. She didn't sleep. She sat near the fire in the good warmth and tried to think about what had just happened in a useful way, but her mind kept sliding off the practical surface of it and landing somewhere more complicated. She was grateful. Of course she was grateful, but gratitude was tangled up with something else. A bristling, uncomfortable feeling that was almost like anger, except she couldn't locate a reasonable target for it. She wasn't angry at Garrick Boone for showing up. She wasn't angry at herself for opening the door. She was angry, she realized slowly, at the gap between what he'd done tonight and what the settlement had not done for 3 years running. She was angry that a stranger had to be the one to come. She was angry that it had come to this, to a night where the fire was dying and the food was gone, and a man she'd exchanged 40 words with in her life had driven through a blizzard to make sure her children didn't starve. She was angry that she'd had to hold a knife at her own door and ask why. She was angry at how close she'd come to not opening that door. Around 4 in the morning, Cora woke up and padded over to her with sleep-crusted eyes, looking at the fire and then at the stacked supplies with an expression of pure, confused wonder. "Mama," she said, "where did all that come from?" Selene pulled her daughter onto her lap and wrapped her arms around the small, warm weight of her. "A man brought it," she said. Cora considered this. "What man?" "A rancher. His name is Mr. Boone. Is he nice?" Selene thought about that for a moment, about a man driving through a blizzard on Christmas night, about the careful way he'd stacked the firewood, about my mother was a widow. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but he did a nice thing." Cora seemed satisfied with this. She leaned her head against Selene's chest and was asleep again in 2 minutes. The twins discovered the supplies at first light and announced them with the particular volume of 8-year-olds who have decided something is extraordinary. Selene was already up making flour porridge, real porridge, thick, with nothing held back. And she let them exclaim and examine the tin of sugar candy and asked 17 questions in a row, only a few of which she answered. Luca was quieter. He stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed, watching her cook, and she could see him doing the same calculations she'd done the night before, reaching the same conclusions. He was 12, and he understood math, and he understood what their supplies had been before last night. "Who brought it?" he asked. "A man named Garrick Boone," she said. "He's a rancher in the valley." "Do we know him?" "Not well." Luca's jaw tightened slightly in a way that was very much like his father's jaw had tightened when Thomas was working something out. What does he want? He said he didn't want anything. People always want something. Selene looked at her son across the small room. He was too old for his age in some ways and still very young in others, and she was never entirely sure which she was dealing with on any given day. Right now, he looked very old. Sometimes they do, she said, and sometimes they're just good people who do things without wanting something back. I'm not sure which one he is yet, but we needed help, and he brought it, and we'll figure out the rest. Luca looked at the supplies against the wall, then at the fire, then back at her. Okay, he said finally, not convinced exactly, but willing to wait and see. Garrick Boone came back at mid-morning as he'd said he would. Selene heard the wagon coming while she was still inside and told herself she wasn't nervous, which was only partially true. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door before he knocked. He had tools with him this time, a proper carpenter's bag, and a coil of rope over his shoulder, and he looked at the exterior of the cabin in daylight with an expression that she couldn't quite read, but suspected was something between concern and professional displeasure. The south wall's not bad, he said. The north is what I was worried about. You've got 2 rotting logs that need to come out and be replaced before they compromise the integrity of the whole wall. If you'll let me, I can do that today. Take maybe 4 hours. Selene looked at him. You just carried supplies in from your ranch in the middle of a blizzard. Now you want to repair my wall. The blizzard part was actually not ideal, he said, with the absolute flattest delivery she'd ever heard from a human being. I thought it would break overnight. It didn't. She stared at him for a moment, and then, completely against her will, she almost laughed. It wasn't funny, exactly. It was just so direct. Most of the men she'd known in this country, Thomas included, wrapped their statements in some amount of performance. Garrick Boone apparently didn't see the need. Come in, she said. I'll make coffee. The twins descended on him the moment he stepped through the door. Eli went straight to the carpenter's bag and asked what every tool was called, and Garrick answered each question in the same flat, patient tone he used for everything else, naming things precisely: claw hammer, draw knife, wood chisel, without the condescension that men sometimes aimed at children. Sam, who was the more physical of the two, immediately wanted to know if he could help, and Garrick looked at him appraisingly and said, "You can hand me things," which Sam received as the highest honor imaginable. Cora watched from the safety of the corner near the fireplace, thumb not quite in her mouth, eyes large and assessing. Luca sat at the table and said nothing, which Selene noted and filed away. The work was loud and cold when Garrick opened up the wall. There was a period of about an hour where the north side of the cabin was fully exposed to the outside, and the children had to crowd around the fireplace while Garrick worked with efficient speed to pull the rotting logs out and fit new sections of timber he'd brought from his ranch. He hadn't mentioned he was bringing timber. He'd just brought it, because he'd apparently looked at the cabin in the dark last night and concluded it would be needed. Selene worked beside him when she could. She wasn't a carpenter, but she was strong and she could hold things steady and hand things up, and she refused to stand aside and watch while another person worked on her house. At one point, she was holding a section of timber in place with both hands against the cold while he drove pins into it, and her fingers were going numb, and she was absolutely not going to say so. "You can let go now," he said. "It's fine." "I have it. You can let go." She let go. Her hands were white at the tips. He looked at them, said nothing, went back to driving the pins. "Thank you," she said after a moment. I mean it. I know you do." He didn't look up. "You don't have to keep saying it." This irritated her. She wasn't sure why. He was right, in the most literal sense that she'd expressed gratitude and he'd heard it, but there was something in the flat dismissal of it that made her want to say something sharp. She pressed her lips together and said nothing, which was the right call. An hour later, the wall was solid and the cold had stopped coming through, and the cabin was warmer than it had been since autumn. She fed him lunch. It wasn't generosity so much as basic human decency. He'd been working in the cold for 4 hours, and it was the middle of the day, and she had food now, actual food, elk meat simmering on the stove in a way that smelled so good it had been making the children hover in the kitchen doorway for the past hour. She set a place at the table and put a bowl down, and he sat without ceremony. The children ate with him at the table. This was not what she'd intended. She'd meant for it to be quick and practical, a meal provided to repay labor. But the twins pulled their stools up beside him with zero hesitation, and Cora eventually crept close enough to sit at the far end, and Luca, after a long pause, sat down across from him. "Mr. Boone," Sam said through a mouthful of food that he absolutely should have finished chewing first. "Do you have children?" "No," Garrick said. "Do you have a wife?" "Sam?" Selene said. "It's fine," Garrick said. He looked at Sam. "No, my wife died 4 years ago." Sam digested this with the directness of 8-year-olds, which is to say, he nodded and moved immediately to the next question. "Do you have animals?" "What kind?" "We used to have a cow, but she died too. And we had chickens, but the winter got them." "I have cattle," Garrick said. "About 200 head, 3 dogs. A horse named Jeremiah who is very opinionated about things." "What kind of things?" "Whether it's too cold to go out, whether the oats are the right kind of oats, whether he likes the person riding him." Eli perked up at this. "What happens if he doesn't like the person riding him?" "He makes sure they know about it." The twins thought this was magnificent. Even Cora smiled from her end of the table, hiding it badly behind her spoon. Luca was looking at Garrick with an expression that Selene couldn't quite categorize. Not hostile, not warm either. Careful, maybe. Evaluating. "You knew our father," Luca said. The table quieted slightly. Garrick looked at him. "I knew who he was," he said. "We talked a few times at the store. Seemed like a man who worked hard at things that didn't always cooperate." Luca looked at the table, then back up. "He was. Most farmers are," Garrick said. "The land here doesn't give you much for free. That's not a comment on the man. That's just Montana." Something in Luca's expression shifted. Not completely, but enough. He went back to eating without the same rigid quality in his shoulders. Selene watched this from her side of the table and said nothing. Garrick Boone did not leave when the meal was over. He asked, without much preamble, if there was other work that needed doing around the property, and Selene told him there was, a fence section down on the east side where a dead tree had fallen in October, a problem with the door to the root cellar that made it nearly impossible to open from the outside, a gap in the roof over the lean-to where the animals had been kept before the animals were gone. He did all of it. By late afternoon, the snow had eased into something lighter, and he was up on the lean-to roof in the cold gray light, and the twins were on the ground below handing up shingles with tremendous seriousness. And Cora had brought her doll outside and was telling it about what was happening as though the doll needed explaining. Luca was beside Selene in the doorway, watching. "He's good at things," Luca said finally. Not admiring exactly, just acknowledging. "Yes," Selene said. "Papa wasn't." He said it carefully, like he was testing whether the words were allowed. He was good at wanting things to work, but he wasn't very good at the actual doing. Selene looked at her son. "Your father loved this family," she said. "Sometimes love is the thing that matters most, and sometimes you need the roof fixed. Both are true." Luca thought about this. "Mr. Boone fixes roofs." "Yes." "Does that mean he could love someone too?" Selene blinked. She had not expected that sentence. "That's a very interesting question for you to be asking right now," she said carefully. Luca shrugged with the elaborate casualness of a 12-year-old pretending not to care about something they care about very much. "I'm just saying," he said. "The roof's been leaking since September and you've been trying to fix it with rags." "I know that. I'm just saying it's nice that someone fixed it." He went back inside. Selene stood in the doorway for another minute, watching Garrick Boone work on a roof, while her daughters narrated events to a cloth doll and her sons handed up shingles with religious solemnity, and she felt something shift inside her, slow and reluctant and real. Not romantic. Not yet. Nothing so clear or named as that. Just the end of something. The end of the particular kind of alone she'd been carrying for 3 years, the kind that had grown so familiar she'd stopped noticing its weight until something, or someone, had shifted the load slightly, just enough for her to feel the difference. Outside, the storm had finally stopped. The whole Highland Valley lay white and still and deep in snow, and above it the sky was clearing from the west in long bands of pale gray turning to blue, the kind of blue that only came after blizzards and looked like the world was starting over whether anyone was ready or not. She was not ready. She wasn't sure that mattered. He stayed until the last of the daylight was gone, which was later than she'd expected and later than was quite practical, given the ride back to his ranch. She said as much when he was packing the tool bag. "I'll be fine," he said. "The temperature's going to drop again tonight. You said yourself, I said it was 20 degrees last night. Tonight it'll be warmer. The storm broke." He buckled the bag. "I've ridden in worse." "That's not—" She stopped. She was about to say that's not reassuring, and she caught herself because what it revealed was that she was worried about him, and she wasn't sure she wanted to reveal that yet. He looked at her with something that might have been amusement if his face did more of that. "I'll be fine, Mrs. Marrow," he said again. Quieter this time. She nodded. He picked up the bag and went to the door, and she followed him out onto the step, because it was just manners, and not because she wasn't ready for him to go, and the night air was cold and clean-smelling after the storm. He was at the wagon before he stopped and turned back. "Mrs. Marrow," he said, "I know this is strange, what I did, coming here. I know you don't know me, and you had every right to leave the door shut." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I know." He looked at her steadily. "I just want you to know that I don't have plans. There's nothing I'm expecting in return. I came because you needed it, and I could do it, that's all." Selene stood on her step in the cold and looked at this man who had driven through a blizzard on Christmas night and built her fire up and repaired her wall and fixed her fence and her cellar door and her roof, and had eaten lunch at her table and answered her children's questions about his opinionated horse, and was now standing in the dark telling her he expected nothing in return. "I know," she said, because she did. She wasn't sure how she knew, but she did. He nodded once, climbed up to the wagon seat. The horses shifted, ready to move. "Happy Christmas, Mrs. Marrow," he said. And then the wheels were moving, and the horses were carrying him down the track and away. And the sound faded slowly into the vast white silence of the Montana highlands. And Selene Marrow stood on her step until she couldn't hear it anymore. Then she went inside to her children and the warm fire and the elk meat simmering low on the stove, and she did not cry. She hadn't cried in 3 years, and she wasn't going to start over something like this. But she sat in the chair by the fire for a long time, very still, with her hands folded in her lap. The oilcloth over the window didn't flap. He'd nailed it down properly before he'd started on the wall. She hadn't noticed until now. She noticed now. Outside, the temperature dropped and the stars came out above the valley in the absolute density that only happens when there's no light for miles in any direction, and the snow caught the starlight and held it, and the whole highland world lay cold and clean and very quiet. And inside the cabin 4 children slept deeply and warm, and the fire burned steadily through the night. It was Christmas. It was the first one in 3 years that didn't feel like something to be survived. He came back 3 days later. Selene had not expected him to. She'd told herself she hadn't expected him to, which was the same as admitting she'd thought about it more than once. Whether he'd come back, whether Christmas night had been a single strange event that would calcify into a story she told her children someday, or whether it was something else. Something that had a next chapter. She was splitting wood behind the cabin when she heard the wagon, and she drove the axe into the block and left it there, brushing her hands on her coat as she came around the side of the building. The morning was clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that turned your exhaled breath into a small private cloud and made the snow squeak underfoot like something in pain. Garrick Boone's wagon came up the track with the same unhurried pace as before, the 2 horses moving steady and patient through the cold. He pulled up and looked down at her from the seat. "You're splitting your own wood," he said. "I've been splitting my own wood for 3 years," she said. "I know." He set the brake. "I brought a maul. Yours is too light for the rounds you're working with. I could hear the axe bouncing off the grain from the track." Selene looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the axe buried in the block, then back at him. "You could hear that from the track," she said. "Sound carries in cold air." He climbed down. "I also brought salt, and a side of cured bacon." This was how the next 2 weeks went. He came every 2 or 3 days, never with announcement, never asking if it was convenient. He came with things, practical things, never excessive, always exactly what was needed in a way that suggested he'd been thinking about it between visits. He brought the heavy maul and split 3 weeks' worth of wood in an afternoon, working with a rhythm that the twins immediately tried to imitate on smaller pieces, with predictably chaotic results. He brought salt and then later oil for the hinges on the main door, which had developed a shriek that woke the children when Selene tried to leave early in the mornings. He brought a length of rope and showed Luca how to rig a proper guideline between the cabin and the root cellar, so that if the snow came heavy again and visibility dropped, there'd be something to hold on to. Luca stood very straight while he learned this and asked precise questions and said thank you with the careful formality of a boy trying to conduct himself like a man. Selene watched from a distance and tried to feel nothing complicated about it. She felt plenty complicated about it. The thing was, Garrick Boone didn't perform. That was the word she kept coming back to. Most men she'd known, in one way or another, performed. They performed competence, or performed generosity, or performed authority, or performed kindness with an audience in mind, with some awareness of how the gesture would land. Thomas had been like that, not manipulatively, but genuinely. He'd wanted people to see him trying, wanted the trying to count for something. Most people were like that. It was human, and she didn't hold it against anyone. Garrick Boone seemed constitutionally incapable of it. He did things because they needed doing, and he said almost nothing about the doing of them. He didn't wait to be thanked. He didn't arrange himself to be seen being helpful. He showed up, worked, ate if she offered food, and left. He talked to her children when they talked to him, which they did with increasing frequency, and he answered their questions with the same flat directness he applied to everything, which they found completely riveting in the way children find riveting anything that doesn't condescend to them. One afternoon, she came out of the cabin to find him seated on the woodpile with Sam on one side and Eli on the other, the three of them examining something in his hand. She came closer and saw it was a compass, old, brass, the needle trembling slightly. "So it always knows which way is north?" Sam said. "Always," Garrick said. "Doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter if you can see the mountains or not. It just knows." "How does it know?" "Magnetism. The Earth has a magnetic field running through it, north to south. The needle lines up with it automatically." Eli took this in with great seriousness. "What if someone broke it?" "Then you'd have to use other methods. Stars, moss on trees, the way the snow drifts relative to the wind." "What if it was cloudy?" "Then you pay attention to the landscape during the day and you remember what you see." "What if you forgot?" Garrick looked at Eli with something close to patience and said, "Then you don't forget the next time." And Eli seemed to find this entirely satisfactory. Selene watched him hand the compass to Sam, who held it like it was made of glass, and she thought, this man had a wife for some amount of time, and that wife is dead, and he has no children, and he lives alone on a ranch 40 miles from anyone. She thought about what that kind of silence did to a person, accumulated over years, whether it made you quieter or whether it made you hunger, quietly, for exactly this. 2 8-year-olds asking endless questions about compasses on a cold January afternoon. She didn't ask him about his wife. It wasn't her place yet. She wasn't sure what her place was yet. The day that things changed, not dramatically, but in a way she felt as a shift in the weather of things, was a Tuesday in the second week of January. She'd been into the settlement. She'd had to go for the post, which came once a week, and had to be collected at the Bourget store, and for a small piece of business at the land office that had been pending since November and couldn't be put off any longer. She'd left the children with strict instructions and walked the 1.5 miles into town in the cold, and the trip had gone the way trips into town had been going since Thomas died. Not dramatically badly, but with the accumulation of small indignities that added up, over time, to something that felt deliberately applied. Martha Bourget had been polite in the brittle way that contains hostility inside of courtesy, handing over the post with a smile that didn't reach anywhere above her mouth. 3 women from the settlement's women's group had been in the store and had looked at Selene with the peculiar combination of pity and distance that she'd come to recognize as their default setting for her. Not outright cruel, never that exposed, but communicating clearly that she was a category of person rather than a person. The land office clerk had made her wait 40 minutes while he handled 2 other men who'd come in after her, and when he finally turned to her, he'd spoken very slowly in the way that some people spoke to her when they heard her accent, as though the accent indicated difficulty with comprehension rather than simply a different origin point. None of this was new. All of it still found the same sore places. She'd walked home in the cold with the post in her coat pocket and the land office matter settled, and a heaviness in her chest that she didn't have the luxury of sitting with for very long, because the children needed lunch and there was always something that needed doing. Garrick's wagon was at her cabin when she came up the track. He was inside, she realized. She could hear the twins through the walls, and she pushed open the door to find him at the table with all 4 children, Luca included, with a map spread out before them that she recognized as a survey map of the valley. He was showing them something, pointing, and they were arranged around him with the focused attention they usually reserved for things that were genuinely interesting. He looked up when she came in. She must have looked something because his expression shifted in a small way, just slightly more attentive. "Town?" he said. "Town," she said, and took her coat off and hung it up and went to start the stove for lunch. He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly enough that the children were still focused on the map. "The Bourgettes, among others. Martha Bourgette," he said, "has the warmth of a well pump in February." Selene almost laughed again. It was the same feeling as the first time, arriving completely without her permission, too accurate and too dry to resist. She kept her back to him and pressed her lips together and focused on the stove. "It's fine," she said. "It's always been like that." "That doesn't make it fine," he said. She turned around at that. He was looking at her steadily from across the room, the children oblivious between them, Sam already asking a question about the map that he'd left temporarily unanswered. "No," she said. "It doesn't." He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the map and answered Sam's question. Later, when the children were occupied and she was washing the lunch dishes, he came and stood near the counter with his coffee cup, not quite beside her, but near enough to talk quietly. "You've been out here 3 years without much help from anyone," he said. "Yes." "And you've managed." "We've managed." She kept washing. "Barely. Some winters. But yes, I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I know you didn't ask for any of this, what I've been doing. I know you didn't come looking for it." She set down the bowl she was washing and looked at him. "Are you apologizing?" "I'm making sure I haven't overstepped." Selene considered this for a moment. There was something almost painful about the directness of it. The fact that he was asking, clearly and without pretense, whether he'd gone too far. Most people didn't ask. Most people either stayed away entirely or inserted themselves without checking whether the insertion was wanted. "You haven't overstepped," she said. "You've helped. Considerably." He nodded once. "I just don't want you to think you need to keep coming," she said. And then, because honesty mattered more than dignity at this point. "But I'd be lying if I said it hadn't made things easier." "Good," he said. "Then I'll keep coming." There was something in the plainness of that, "then I'll keep coming," that settled into her chest in a way she couldn't quite account for. No performance, no declaration, just a simple statement of intention, offered without drama. She picked the bowl back up and finished washing it. "Your horse," she said. "Jeremiah. What breed is he?" "Quarter horse, brown mostly, with a white foot on the left rear that he seems embarrassed about." "Embarrassed?" "He steps in a particular way when he's on soft ground, like he's hoping nobody notices the foot." She did laugh at that. An actual one, short and involuntary. He didn't react much, just looked like a man who'd said a true thing and had it received correctly. It was the first time she'd laughed in a while. She noticed that too. The trouble started, formally, publicly, on the second Saturday of January, which was when the settlement held its monthly community gathering at the Bourgette store. Selene had never attended these gatherings, or rather she'd stopped attending after the second year, when it had become clear that her presence was tolerated rather than welcomed, and the social architecture of the room was built around networks she was not part of and would not be made part of. She stayed home on those Saturdays and let the settlement gather without her. But Luca's situation was different. Luca had been attending the settlement school, which convened 3 days a week in the back of the same Bourgette store, because education was not something Selene was willing to sacrifice to social discomfort. She'd sent him since he was 8, and would send him until there was no more to learn from the settlement's teacher, a thin, nervous man named Aldous Peck, who was probably more qualified than his setting suggested. Luca was a good student, and she'd told herself that was what mattered. She'd been telling herself that less convincingly for the past several months, since it had become apparent that Luca's life at school was more difficult than he reported. The particular difficulty had a name: Fletcher Bourgette. Owen Bourgette's son, 13, big for his age in the soft way of boys who've been well fed all their lives, and have decided that the world will continue to accommodate them. Fletcher had been giving Luca trouble since September, in the incremental, deniable way that boys that age were capable of. Comments that could be reframed as jokes, social exclusions that could be attributed to coincidence, the particular cruelty of being laughed at just within earshot. Luca had told her almost none of this. She'd pieced it together from what the twins had overheard, and from the particular quality of Luca's silence when he came home from school. She hadn't known what to do about it. That was the honest answer. The people with authority in this settlement were the same people whose approval she did not have, and making a formal complaint about Owen Bourget's son to the structure that Owen Bourget largely controlled seemed like a way to make Luca's situation worse rather than better. So she'd been waiting, which was its own kind of failing, and she knew it. What happened that Saturday happened in front of the Bourget store. In the 20 minutes after the gathering broke up, when people stood outside in the cold and talked. Selene wasn't there. Garrick was, as it happened. He came into town occasionally for supplies, and he'd arrived that afternoon without knowing the gathering was underway. He told her all of this afterward, plainly, without trying to frame it in a way that softened it. Luca had been outside the store waiting for his mother to send him a message through a neighboring family about a piece of fabric she'd ordered. Fletcher Bourget had come out of the store with 2 other boys his age, and with an audience available, had elevated his usual behavior into something more public and more deliberately cutting. What he'd said exactly, Garrick repeated to her verbatim, because she asked, and he didn't see the point in softening it. He'd called Luca a poor foreigner's bastard, and told him that his mother was charity trash that the settlement was stuck with because nobody had the heart to run her off properly. 12 words, the kind that don't leave once they've been said. Luca hadn't moved. He'd stood very still in the way he slept, like a person standing watch, like a person who had decided that stillness was safer than anything else, and said nothing, while Fletcher Bourget waited to see if he'd cry. Garrick had been 20 feet away at the hitching post. He'd walked over. He told her what he'd done without much dramatization. He'd stood in front of Fletcher Bourget and waited until the boy looked at him, and then he'd said quietly that what had just come out of Fletcher's mouth was an embarrassment to his parents and to the settlement, and that he'd be walking back over to Luca and delivering an apology before Garrick walked away from the spot. Fletcher had tried to bluster. He was Owen Bourget's son and accustomed to a certain amount of social armor. But Garrick had just stood there with the same stillness and said, "The apology, Fletcher, now." It had taken a minute and a half. Then Fletcher had mumbled something in the direction of Luca's boots that was technically an apology. And Garrick had said, "Look at him when you say it." And after another long pause, Fletcher had looked up and said sorry with an expression of profound resentment. Garrick had said, "Good," and walked away. He was at her cabin when Luca arrived home. Luca came through the door with a particular expression, tight and complicated, somewhere between humiliation and something else Selene couldn't name yet. And Garrick was at the table drinking coffee, and he didn't say a word about it when Luca came in, just nodded at him the way he always nodded, as though nothing remarkable had occurred. And Luca had sat down at the table across from him and said quietly, "Thank you." And Garrick had said, "He was wrong about your mother." And then neither of them had said anything else about it. Selene had heard this whole account third hand, from Garrick's telling, and from what she'd eventually gotten out of Luca by degrees, the pieces he'd allow, offered one at a time like he was deciding how much weight she could carry. She'd listened to all of it without interrupting. When Garrick finished, she sat with it for a moment and then said, "Owen Bourget is not going to be pleased." "No," Garrick said. "He won't be. You made an enemy today. Owen Bourget's been lukewarm on me for years." He shrugged, the smallest possible shrug. "He'll survive the temperature drop." "This wasn't your fight," she said. He looked at her across the table. It was a 12-year-old boy standing alone in the cold while someone called his mother charity trash. He picked up his coffee cup. "I wasn't going to walk past that." Selene looked at the table surface. The wood was scarred and old. Thomas's table, carried from the previous cabin when they'd built this one. She ran her thumb along one of the deeper marks. "It's going to make things harder," she said. "For us. People will talk." "People are already talking," he said. "I've been coming out here twice a week for 2 weeks. People notice things. Whatever they're saying, they're already saying it." She looked up. "What are they saying?" He met her eyes. that we're connected in some way they haven't categorized yet. Some of them think I'm pitying you. Some of them think there's something between us that isn't appropriate. He said it plainly, like reading weather. The Bourgettes think I'm making a mistake. Harding at the land office thinks I've lost my judgment. Selene sat with this. And what do you think? Garrick set the cup down. He was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet she'd learned was not avoidance, but actual thought. I think, he said, that I've been alone a long time, and I came out here on Christmas night because I couldn't stop thinking about a woman trying to keep 4 children warm in a cabin that was half open to the wind, and that since then I've come back because the coming back felt like the right thing to do. He paused. I'm not pretending I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm not going to pretend there's something wrong with it either. The room was quiet. From somewhere in the back, the sound of the twins arguing over something small and irrelevant filtered through. You told me you didn't have plans, Selene said. I didn't, he said. I still don't. Plans are one thing. Intentions are another. She looked at him. He looked back at her with those dark, steady eyes that gave away less than most people's did and more than he probably realized. I need to think, she said. I know. About what all of this means. I know, he said again. I'm not... She stopped, started over. I have 4 children. I'm a foreign woman in a settlement that's been looking for an excuse to dismiss me since Thomas died. If I attach myself to you publicly in any way, I hand them that excuse. Yes. And I have to live with whatever consequences that brings. My children have to live with it. Yes, he said. That's all true. So you understand why I need to think. I do. He didn't push. He didn't try to preempt her thinking or redirect it or offer her a reason why the consequences weren't as bad as she imagined. He just acknowledged them. It was one of the things about him that she could not find fault with, however much the rest of the situation frightened her. He did not minimize. He left shortly after. Selene stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go, which she'd done enough times now that Cora had started calling it watching Mr. Boone leave, as though it were a category of activity like washing dishes or mending socks. Are you going to marry Mr. Boone? Cora asked from beside her, with the absolute casualness of 7-year-olds asking the most direct possible question. Selene looked down at her. Where did that come from? Sam said you were. Selene made a note to have a conversation with Sam. Mr. Boone is a friend, she said. Cora considered this. He fixed our roof. Yes. And our wall, and the fence, and the cellar door. Yes, Cora. Friends don't usually do all that. Selene opened her mouth and then closed it again, because a 7-year-old had just made a more precise observation than most adults would have managed. No, she said finally. They don't usually. She didn't sleep well that night, or the night after. She was working through something that didn't resolve cleanly, that had too many edges and too many people attached to it. There was what she felt, which was real and growing, and not something she could honestly dismiss. There was what she feared, which was also real. The settlement's judgment, the impact on Luca's school situation, the way her children were already attaching to this man in ways that would hurt if it ended. And there was the practical question of what any of this actually meant, because Garrick had spoken of intentions without specifying them, and she wasn't willing to read meaning into what hadn't been said. On the 3rd night, she stopped trying to think it into resolution and simply acknowledged what was true. She had not been this seen by another adult human being in 3 years, possibly longer. Thomas had loved her, genuinely, and with his whole impractical heart, but Thomas had also needed her in ways that made it difficult to tell sometimes whether he saw her or saw the person who kept things together when he couldn't. Garrick Boone looked at her, just looked at her, with an attention that felt like being located, found. Like he was looking for Selene Merrow specifically and had identified her correctly and was now engaged with exactly that person. It frightened her half to death. But fear and wrong were not the same thing, and she was old enough and tired enough to know the difference. On the 4th morning, she was up before the children and had the stove going and was sitting with her coffee in the pre-dawn dark, when she heard the sound she'd been unconsciously listening for, the slow crunch of wagon wheels coming up the track. She went to the door and opened it before he could knock. He stopped at the bottom of the step and looked up at her. You're early, she said. I had something to bring. He held up a bundle she hadn't noticed in the dark. Cloth, folded, a kind of deep red that she couldn't quite see properly in the low light. Wool, I thought, it's cold in the mornings, and your coat's getting thin at the elbows. Selene looked at the wool, then at him. You notice too much, she said. It's a flaw, he said. She stepped back from the door to let him in, and this time it felt different from all the other times. More deliberate, less uncertain, more like an answer. He came in and set the wool on the table, and she poured him coffee without being asked, because she'd learned by now how he took it, and she was done pretending she hadn't, and they sat across from each other in the quiet before the children woke, and she said, I've been thinking. I know, he said. I haven't finished, she said. I know that too. She wrapped her hands around her cup. Outside, the Highland winter pressed its cold weight against the walls that he'd repaired, and the fire burned steady in the grate, and somewhere in the back her children slept the deep sleep of the warm and fed. But I'm not stopping you from coming, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever I'm still working out, I'm not stopping you from coming. Garrick Boone looked at her across the table with his dark, careful eyes. All right, he said, just that. Just, all right. Like it was enough. Like her choosing not to stop him was the same as choosing something, which maybe it was. They sat in the early morning quiet and drank their coffee and said nothing else until Cora padded out from the back room and stopped when she saw Garrick at the table and said, with complete unsurprise, Oh, you're here early. I am, he said. Are you staying for breakfast? He looked at Selene. Selene looked at her daughter and then at the man across the table from her and said, Set another place, Cora. The decision formed the way most of Selene's decisions formed, not in a single moment of clarity, but through the slow accumulation of smaller moments until the weight of them tipped something over inside her. It had been 3 weeks since she'd told Garrick she wasn't stopping him from coming. 3 weeks of breakfasts and repairs and children asking questions about compasses and opinionated horses. 3 weeks of the settlement's awareness of Garrick Boone's wagon tracks leading to and from her property becoming something that people discussed in ways that found their way back to her through the particular channels that small communities use to communicate disapproval. A comment from Martha Bourget delivered with a smile, a silence from 2 women outside the post office that lasted a beat too long. Aldous Peck at the school asking Luca, in front of the class, whether his mother had found herself a new arrangement. Luca had come home and told her that last one with his jaw set tight and his eyes very careful, watching her face for how to feel about it. She'd felt her hands go still on the bread she was kneading. What did you say? She asked. I said I didn't know what he meant, Luca said, and then I went back to my work. Good, she said. That was exactly right. But she'd kneaded that bread with more force than it strictly required, and when Garrick came 2 days later, she told him what Peck had said and watched his expression go flat in a specific way she'd learned meant something was being suppressed. Aldous Peck, he said, is a man who has never been in a position to be talked about and doesn't know how it feels. That's not the point, she said. The point is that it's getting worse, not better. I know, and hiding doesn't help. Every time I come and go from that settlement with my eyes down and my business done quickly, every time I let them make me invisible, it gets a little worse, because silence reads like agreement. Garrick looked at her steadily. What are you thinking? He asked, and that was when Selene told him what she'd decided. She was going to the settlement on Saturday, the community gathering. She'd been avoiding it for 2 years, and she was done avoiding it. She was going, and she wanted him to come with her. He didn't hesitate. All right. They'll make it a spectacle. Probably. It might make your situation in the valley worse. Owen Bourget already... Selene. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and it stopped her. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without fanfare, but with a weight to it that made it mean more than it might have from someone else. I know what I'm agreeing to. I'm agreeing to it. She nodded, looked at the table, looked back up. Wear the better coat, she said. Something moved across his face that was almost a smile. I'll keep it in mind. Saturday arrived with the particular cruelty of a Montana January that has decided to demonstrate what it's capable of. Not a blizzard, but a deep, settled cold that made the air feel solid and gave every sound a sharp, carrying quality. Selene dressed carefully. She had one good dress, a dark green wool she'd made herself 3 years ago from fabric she'd ordered through the mail, fitted properly because she'd spent the time to make it fit and not apologized for the effort. She wore her heaviest coat over it and her good boots, and she put her hair up in the style she'd stopped wearing after Thomas died, because it had felt like vanity she didn't have room for. She looked in the small mirror above the wash basin and saw someone who looked like a woman who intended to be seen. The twins asked why she was dressed up. "Because I feel like it," she said. Cora examined her with large eyes and said, "You look like you're going to say something important." "Maybe I am," Selene said. She left the 4 children with old Vera Hallstrom, the one neighbor within reasonable distance who'd maintained something close to genuine warmth. A Norwegian widow of 70 whose opinion of settlement gossip was efficiently expressed with a single word Selene had never tried to translate. Vera had watched the children before and handled them with the cheerful iron authority of someone who'd raised 6 of her own and feared nothing. Garrick met her at the track junction, which they'd agreed on. He was there when she came around the bend sitting on the wagon seat with his better coat. She noticed it immediately, dark wool, well kept. And he looked at her for a moment when she came into view, and something in his face settled, like he'd been waiting for confirmation of something. He climbed down and offered her his hand up to the seat. She took it. His hand was cold and rough and solid. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go." The Bourget store was full when they arrived, which was expected. It was always full on community Saturdays, the once-a-month event that served as social architecture for the whole settlement. Wagons were hitched along the front, and people stood outside in the cold talking before heading in, and Selene watched from the wagon seat as Garrick pulled up and set the brake, and she saw the moment, a particular rippling moment, when people noticed who was sitting beside him. It moved through the crowd the way a stone moves through water. First the nearest people, then further out. And then the talking adjusted, quieted, reorganized around this new information. She watched it happen and felt her spine straighten involuntarily, the way it always did when she was frightened and refused to show it. Garrick climbed down and came around to her side and offered his hand again, and she took it and stepped down, and they walked toward the store entrance side by side. Nobody said anything immediately. That was the more sophisticated version of what she'd expected. Not a direct confrontation, but the loaded silence that communities use instead, layered with looks that communicated entire paragraphs without a word spoken. She met eyes when eyes were offered, and did not look away first. Garrick walked beside her with his hands in his coat pockets, and his expression entirely neutral, and he nodded at the 2 men near the door, who nodded back with the reflexive awkwardness of people caught between social currents. Inside the store was warm and smelled of tobacco and wood smoke and the particular human density of too many people in a contained space. Conversation continued around them, but it had a self-conscious quality now, a raised volume that was trying a little too hard to seem normal. Owen Bourget was behind the counter. He was a big man, Owen. Not fat, but wide, with the kind of physical presence that small-town commercial power tends to cultivate over time. He had a red face and small eyes, and he'd never been directly unkind to Selene in a way she could name, which made his particular flavor of condescension harder to address than outright hostility would have been. He looked at her, and then at Garrick, and then back at her, and his expression went through something complicated before settling on a practiced blankness. "Garrick," he said. "Owen," Garrick said. "Mrs. Marrow." The slight emphasis on the title was barely perceptible. "Didn't expect to see you at one of these." "I imagine not," Selene said. A woman named Clara Harding, wife of the land office clerk, materialized at Selene's left with the social radar of someone who monitors these things professionally. She was not unkind, Clara, but she was a carrier of the settlement's opinion, a transmitter and receiver of its social frequencies. "Mrs. Marrow," she said, with the slightly elevated warmth of someone who'd decided to be gracious about an uncomfortable situation. "How are you managing this winter? We were all so concerned about you after the drought." Also concerned, Selene thought. Also concerned who brought nothing and said nothing for 4 months. "We're managing well," she said. "Better than well, actually." She didn't add thanks to the man standing beside me, though she could feel the implication hanging in the air between them. Clara's eyes moved to Garrick and back. "Yes, I heard. Well, it's very kind of Garrick to have helped out. Very neighborly." "It is," Selene agreed. Garrick said nothing. He'd positioned himself slightly to her left and behind, close enough to be clearly together but not crowding her, leaving the conversation to her while remaining visibly present. She understood that this was deliberate and appreciated the calibration of it. The gathering proceeded. Selene stood her ground in the room and talked to the 2 or 3 people who addressed her with something approaching genuine friendliness. Vera's nephew, a young farmer named Daniel Thorpe, who'd always been decent. The school teacher Peck's wife, who was a better person than her husband and seemed aware of it. She drank the terrible coffee that was always served at these things, and she did not make herself small, and she did not leave early. It was going, if not well, then at least tolerably. And then she heard Luca's voice outside. It came through the store's front wall with the particular carrying quality of the cold air, raised, sharp-edged, trying to stay controlled and not quite managing. She was moving toward the door before she'd consciously decided to, and Garrick was beside her, and they came out onto the step to find a cluster of boys near the side of the building and Luca in the middle of it. Fletcher Bourget was there. 3 other boys with him, all older than Luca, all arranged in the particular geometry of a group that has decided someone is surrounded. Luca stood with his back to the wall, which was pragmatic but also told Selene everything she needed to know about how it had started. She didn't know yet what had been said. She would find out later. It was worse than the last time, specific and personal, reaching for the things boys reach for when they want to draw blood and have been told they can't use their fists. Fletcher had said something about Luca's mother and the rancher, something that used words Selene would not repeat, that made what was between her and Garrick into something dirty. 12 years old, and he'd heard it from somewhere. 12 years old, and he'd had to stand there and hold it. What she saw when she came through the door was Luca's face, the specific white-knuckled expression of a boy who is deciding, in real time, whether to hold his ground or break. The twins weren't there. They were inside with Vera somewhere. It was just Luca, alone, against a wall. Fletcher saw Garrick first. The change in his posture was immediate and involuntary. A pulling back, a recalibration of what he'd calculated he could get away with. Selene stepped forward. Not Garrick. Her. She walked to the edge of the group and stopped, and the boys parted with the instinctive response of young people who have been raised to recognize adult authority when it presents itself. She looked at Fletcher Bourget with the particular clarity that comes from 3 years of accumulated injustice arriving at a single point. "What are you doing?" she said. Quiet. Very quiet. Fletcher lifted his chin. He was 13 and he had his father's wide-shouldered build and his mother's brittle confidence, and right now he was looking at her with something that was trying to be contempt and not quite getting there. "We were just talking," he said. "No," she said. "You weren't." She moved past him to Luca, put one hand briefly on her son's shoulder. Checking, not comforting, she needed to know he was whole, and felt him exhale very slightly under her touch. "Come here," she said, and he stepped forward and she turned back to the group. Garrick had come to stand 10 feet back, far enough to not be the one handling this. Close enough. Selene looked at Fletcher Bourget and the 3 boys with him, and she said, slowly and with the precision of someone who has chosen every word, "I know what was said here. I know the kind of thing you say when you think no one's listening, and I want you to understand something, not for my sake, but for yours. What you are practicing right now, what you are learning to do, this cruelty you're rehearsing, you will carry it for a long time. It will cost you things you can't see yet." Fletcher stared at her. Whatever he'd expected from the foreign widow, it wasn't this calm, this specificity, this complete absence of the deference he'd been taught she owed him. Owen Bourget appeared at the store doorway. He'd heard something, or someone had told him. He came down the step with the expression of a man who has arrived to manage a situation and is not yet sure whose side he's on. "What's going on out here, he said. "Your son," Selene said, turning to look at him directly, "has been saying things to my boy that you would not want repeated in front of the settlement." Owen's face did something. "Now boys will be boys." "No," Selene said. "That's not what this is." The words came out of her with a flatness that surprised even her. Flat and solid, like the heavy maul Garrick had brought for the wood. She said, "Your son called my 12-year-old boy names I won't repeat to describe what he thinks of me and my family. He did it last month and he did it today. And you standing here and telling me boys will be boys tells me everything about where he learned to do it. The silence outside the Bourget store had the quality of the cold air itself, complete, carrying. People had come to the doorway and the windows. This was being witnessed. Owen Bourget's red face went a shade redder. Mrs. Marrow, I don't think— Fletcher, Garrick said. One word, not loud, but it had the quality of his particular kind of stillness, absolute and fully meant. Fletcher looked at him. Apologize to Luca, Garrick said. A real one. Then go inside. My father— Your father isn't who you answer to right now, Garrick said. You said something that you know was wrong. That's what matters. Apologize. Owen Bourget took a sharp breath. Now, Garrick, you've got no business. He's right. The voice came from behind Owen, from the doorway. Daniel Thorpe, the young farmer, standing with his hands in his pockets. He's right, Owen. Let the boy apologize. Owen turned to look at him with an expression of pure betrayal. Fletcher's confidence had been built on a foundation that had just developed several visible cracks. He looked at his father, who was looking at Daniel Thorpe, who was looking back with the mild stubbornness of someone who'd decided something. Sorry, Fletcher said. He was looking at Luca's collar, not his face. His eyes, Garrick said. Same tone, same flatness. A pause that felt longer than it was. Fletcher looked up, looked at Luca's face. Sorry, he said again, and this time there was something in it. Not genuine remorse, not yet. He was too young and too proud for that, but something real underneath the resentment, something that knew. Selene put her hand on Luca's shoulder again, and they walked back toward the store together. The crowd at the doorway divided to let them through, and she felt their eyes, but she did not look at them. Not yet. She was looking at Luca's face, the profile of him, the jaw that was Thomas's, and the eyes that were hers, and she was watching the thing he was working through. The humiliation, and something else, something harder and cleaner. Pride, maybe. The specific kind that comes from being stood up for. Inside at the counter, Clara Harding was looking at her with an expression she hadn't expected. Not the practiced graciousness of before, but something more genuine. Uncomfortable, maybe. Like a woman who'd witnessed something that had rearranged a few things. Martha Bourget was behind the counter beside her husband's usual spot, and her face was the face of a woman who had arrived at a specific rage. She said nothing. For once, she said nothing. Selene got her coffee, cold now, she didn't care, and stood with Luca beside her and waited for Garrick to come back in. He came through the door 2 minutes later and crossed the room to where they stood and looked at Luca. You good? He said. Luca considered this with the seriousness he applied to most things. Yes, he said. Then, after a pause, Fletcher's going to hate me more now. Probably, Garrick said. For a while. Then he'll move on to something else. How do you know? Because boys like Fletcher need an audience to keep going. Today he didn't get one. That changes the math. Luca thought about this. What if it doesn't change? Then we deal with what comes, Garrick said. You're not handling it alone. You haven't been, for a while now. Luca was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he looked up at Garrick and said, My father used to say that. And then, before anyone could respond to that, I'm going to get some water. And he walked away toward the back of the store. Selene watched him go. Garrick stood beside her without speaking for a moment. The room had returned to something approaching its normal volume, though with an undercurrent that would be discussed later in various kitchens. Owen's not going to forget today, she said. No, Garrick said. You've made an enemy there, a real one. Owen Bourget was never my friend. He picked up a piece of the terrible coffee from the counter, looked at it, set it back down. He's a man who confuses social position with being right. That's a specific kind of person, and they don't change much. He has influence here. He does. Garrick looked at her. Does that change what needed to happen today? Selene thought about Fletcher's face when Luca looked him in the eye. Thought about Luca's shoulders on the walk back inside, the particular set of them. No, she said. It doesn't. Good. They stood in the warm, crowded room and finished what passed for the gathering, and when it was done and people filed out into the cold, Selene noted who walked past without speaking and who offered a small acknowledgement. Nod, brief word, Nothing significant, but present. Daniel Thorpe shook her hand on his way out and said, "Ma'am," with no ceremony and no apology, as though speaking to her were simply the obvious thing to do. It was such a small thing. She felt it anyway. The ride back to her cabin was quiet. Luca had come with them at her insistence, sitting in the wagon bed with his back against the sideboards, watching the landscape go by. The afternoon light was going gold and flat, the way winter light did this late in the day, and the whole valley lay under it like something that had been pressed and preserved. Halfway home, Luca said from the wagon bed, "Mr. Boone." Garrick half turned. "Why did you come to our cabin on Christmas?" It wasn't a question the way he said it, more like something he'd been holding for a while and had decided now was when he'd put it down. Garrick didn't answer immediately. He drove for a moment, looking at the track. "Because I drove past your property in November," he said, "and I saw the state of the crops and the state of the cabin, and I thought about it too long not to do something about it." "You drove past in November and you came at Christmas," Luca said. "That's a month." "I know. Why'd it take a month?" Garrick was quiet again. Then, "Because it's not nothing showing up at a widow's door with supplies. It means something, and I didn't know if it would be welcome. I thought about it until I decided that the risk of her being offended was smaller than the risk of the alternative." Luca processed this. The alternative being we starved. The alternative being you had a very bad winter. Luca looked at the back of Garrick's head for a moment. Then he looked out at the valley. "She doesn't show when she's scared," Luca said. "My mother. She hides it. But I can tell." "I know," Garrick said. "She was scared that night, before she opened the door." "I know." "She opened it anyway." "She did." Another silence. Then Luca said, very quietly, as though he were talking to himself as much as anyone, "She's not scared of you anymore." Garrick didn't respond to that. He just drove, and the wagon moved through the cold afternoon. And Selene sat beside him on the seat, listening to her son and this man talk in the flat, careful way of people who were being very honest with each other. And she felt the thing in her chest that had no clean name, the one that had started on Christmas night when the fire was almost gone, shift again, settle deeper. Not fear anymore. Not exactly. Something that was going to require a decision. They reached the cabin as the light was failing, and Vera met them at the door with the twins arguing behind her and Cora already in her nightclothes, even though it was nowhere near bedtime, and the normal chaos of 4 children redistributed itself across the cabin with the natural violence of a tide coming in. Garrick unloaded 2 things he'd had in the wagon, a small crate of preserved peaches that he set on the table with no explanation, and a book that he handed to Luca without ceremony. Luca looked at the cover. "This is a surveying manual." "I know." "Why? Because you asked good questions about the map," Garrick said, "and because understanding land is useful in Montana." Luca held the book and looked at it for a moment with an expression that he tried to control and didn't entirely manage. Then he looked up and said, "Thank you." And this time it came out differently than it had before. Not the careful, formal gratitude of a boy conducting himself like a man, but something less composed and more real. Garrick nodded, picked up his coat from the hook by the door, looked at Selene. She walked him out to the step. The cold had gone deep and serious now, the stars coming out in the east, the west still holding a thin line of color along the mountains. "You're going to have to tell me," she said, "at some point what you actually want." He looked at her. "I think you know." "I want to hear it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the line of mountains. Then back at her. "I want to come back," he said. "Not to fix things, not to bring supplies. To come back because this is where I want to be." He paused. "I want to make a life somewhere that has more than one person in it. And I'd like it to be here, if you're willing." The words were simple. He said them the way he did everything, without performance, without strategic framing, just the truth as he understood it, offered plainly and left for her to do with what she would. Selene stood on her step in the dark and felt the full weight of what was being offered and what it would cost and what it might become. "I'm not there yet," she said, "but I'm not saying no." "That's enough," he said. He walked to the wagon. She watched him go, and this time there was something different in the watching. Not just the absence of aloneness, but the presence of something else, something that was still unnamed but was growing anyway, the way things grew in Montana despite the cold, stubbornly, and without asking permission. Inside, Cora had stolen one of the preserved peaches and was attempting to look innocent about it. Selene sat down at the table and pulled her daughter onto her lap and said nothing about the peach. Outside, the wagon wheels faded into the dark. 3 days passed after the gathering, and Garrick didn't come. Selene told herself this was normal. He had a ranch to run. 200 head of cattle didn't manage themselves through January, and she knew from what he'd mentioned in passing that winter was the hardest season for the animals, the time when losses happened if you weren't paying constant attention. His absence had a reasonable explanation, and she was not a woman who invented problems where none existed. She told herself this on the first day and mostly believed it. On the second day, she caught herself listening for wagon wheels at intervals she wasn't proud of. On the third day, Luca came home from school and sat down at the table and said without preamble, "People are saying Mr. Boone came to his senses." Selene set down what she was doing. "Who said that?" "Heard it from 2 boys in the yard." Luca's voice was careful. He was watching her face the way he always watched her face when he was delivering something difficult. "They said Owen Bourget told their father that Garrick Boone finally came to his senses about our situation, that it wasn't appropriate and he'd figured it out." The room was very quiet. "What do you think?" Selene asked. Luca was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think Owen Bourget says what he wants to be true and calls it news." He picked up the surveying manual from the table. He'd been reading it each evening, methodically, making small notes in the margin, and looked at the cover. "I also think Mr. Boone hasn't been here in 3 days. He has a ranch to—" "I know," Luca said. "I'm just saying what's true." She didn't argue with him because she couldn't. What was true was true. That evening, after the children were in bed, she sat with the fire and worked through the arithmetic of her own feelings with the same methodical honesty she'd applied to the flour and the salt pork back in December. What she found when she was done being evasive about it was this. She was more afraid of losing something she hadn't fully claimed yet than she'd let herself admit. She'd told him she wasn't there yet. She'd told him she wasn't saying no. Both of those were true when she'd said them. But 3 days of silence and a secondhand report about Owen Bourget's satisfaction had clarified something faster than she'd expected. She was not willing to let this particular thing go without a fight. The problem was, she didn't know yet what she was fighting. On the 4th morning, she put on her heavy coat and told Luca he was in charge until she came back and walked down the track in the cold, alone, toward the road that led to Garrick Boone's ranch. She'd never been there. She had a general sense of its direction and a set of landmarks he'd mentioned in passing. The triple-trunked cottonwood at the Valley Fork, the stone fence line that marked the beginning of his property, the ridge that put it in shadow by mid-afternoon in winter. She followed the road for 40 minutes with her breath clouding and her boots finding the frozen ruts underneath the snow. And when she came to the stone fence line, she knew she was in the right place. The ranch house was bigger than she'd imagined and less impressive than the word ranch sometimes suggested. It was a solid, practical structure of dark timber with a long porch and smoke coming from 2 chimneys, surrounded by outbuildings that sprawled in the functional way of working operations that have been added onto over years without much thought to aesthetics. A dog appeared from somewhere and barked twice at her before apparently deciding she wasn't a threat and sitting down. She was halfway to the porch when the door opened. Garrick stood in the doorway and looked at her. He was in his working clothes, flannel, heavy trousers, the kind of dress that meant he'd been up since before light doing things that needed doing. He looked tired. Not the tired of laziness, but the specific worn quality of a man who hadn't been sleeping well, which she recognized because she knew what it looked like on herself. "Selene," he said. "Something's wrong," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her for a moment, then stepped back from the door. She came up the porch steps and inside. The house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the particular smell of a place occupied by one person for a long time. Not unclean, but singular, without the layered smells of multiple lives being lived in it. The main room had a table and 2 chairs and a long shelf of books and a stone fireplace and a general sense of function without comfort, of everything in its place, but nothing placed for pleasure. She'd expected something like this. She hadn't expected it to feel as lonely as it did. He poured her coffee without asking. She sat at the table. He sat across from her and looked at his own cup for a moment and then looked up. "I've been trying to work something out," he said. "I can see that. I think I've been making things worse for you." He said it plainly, the way he said difficult things. No evasion, but also no drama. What happened at the Bourget store? Fletcher, Owen. The way people are talking now, I came into your life and I've given this settlement exactly the ammunition it wanted. You didn't give them anything, she said. They were already looking. Maybe. But before me, there was nothing to find. He picked up his cup, put it down without drinking. You had 3 years of hard silence, judgments without handles. Now they have a handle. And you think leaving fixes that? I think staying might not. Selene looked at him across the table. She was working to keep her voice level because what she felt wasn't calm. Who told you that Owen Bourget is satisfied? She said. He blinked slightly, just slightly. Where did you hear? Luca heard it at school. Someone's father said Garrick Boone came to his senses. She held his gaze. Did you go talk to Owen Bourget? A pause. He came to the ranch, Garrick said. Day before yesterday. He made certain things clear. What things? That my grazing lease on the east section of Valleyland runs through his family's original claim and that there's been an informal agreement in place for 15 years that he could choose to revisit. He said it without inflection, which somehow made it worse. He wasn't threatening exactly. He was informing me of a reality. Selene was quiet for a moment. Then, so he threatened you. He outlined a fact. Garrick. Yes, he said. He threatened me. The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the porch eaves with a low, flat sound. And you were going to let that work, she said. You were going to come to some conclusion that your leaving was the right thing, and then she stopped. Were you going to tell me? Or were you just going to stop coming? His jaw tightened. She'd found something real there. Not anger, but a kind of shame. The kind that comes from being caught at something you knew was wrong before anyone said it. I was going to tell you, he said. I hadn't figured out how. The same way you figure out everything, she said. You just say it. It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. He looked at her. She looked back. Outside the window, the winter light was thin and cold and honest. You drove through a blizzard on Christmas night, she said, to bring flour and firewood to a woman you barely knew. And now Owen Bourget makes a comment about a grazing lease, and you've spent 4 days talking yourself into disappearing. She kept her voice even with some effort. That's not you working out what's right. That's you being scared and dressing it up as consideration. The words landed. She saw them land. He didn't argue with them. You have 4 children, he said after a moment. His voice was lower now. If my staying makes Luca's school situation worse, if it gives Bourget reason to make your land dealings more difficult, if it gives the settlement a reason to treat you worse than they will always find a reason, she said. That's what I've been learning for 8 years. It's not about the reason. The reason is whatever's handy. She leaned forward slightly. You know what the difference is between this winter and every winter before it? Not the supplies, not the wall. It's that someone was here. My children had a table with more than 4 people at it. My son has a surveying manual with margin notes he's making at 11 o'clock at night because he can't stop reading it. My daughter stopped putting her thumb in her mouth. She paused. You don't take that away because Owen Bourget is annoyed. Garrick sat with this for a long moment. Then he said quietly, I sold my father's watch. She hadn't expected that. The shift in direction was abrupt enough that she just waited. The supplies I brought on Christmas, he said. The flour and the meat and the firewood, The ranch had a bad quarter. Some of the herd I'd expected to sell in November didn't move the way I'd planned, and cash was shorter than I'd anticipated. He looked at his hands on the table. My father's watch was the only thing of real value I had that wasn't tied to the land. I sold it to a man in town 2 weeks before Christmas. That's what paid for everything. Selene didn't speak. I'm not telling you that for... He stopped. I'm not telling you so you'll feel obligated. I'm telling you because you asked me once if I had plans, and I said I didn't. And that was true then, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I drove past your property in November, and something happened that I don't entirely know how to explain, and by the time I sold the watch, I'd already made a decision I hadn't articulated yet. He looked up at her. I couldn't watch you fight alone. That's the simplest way I can say it. I couldn't watch it and do nothing. The room was very quiet. Selene thought about a watch. She thought about a man she barely knew making a decision in November, in private, without telling anyone, that had cost him something real. She thought about the fire on Christmas night and the careful way he'd stacked the firewood and the 4 trips he'd made in the dark. "Your father's watch," she said. "He wore it every day for 30 years. It was a good watch." He said it without self-pity, which made it harder. It did what it was supposed to do. She stood up from the table. He looked up at her. "Come here," she said. He stood. She was shorter than him by several inches, and she was looking up at him, and she reached out and put one hand flat against his chest, over the flannel, where she could feel the slow, solid beat of his heart under her palm. "You are not leaving," she said. His hand came up and covered hers. His hands were still rough and red at the knuckles from the cold, the same as they'd been on Christmas night. "Selene, I am not finished." She held his gaze. "You came in December because you couldn't watch me fight alone. I'm here now because I cannot watch you talk yourself out of something real, because Owen Borgett made a comment about a grazing lease." She felt his hand tighten slightly over hers. "Whatever this is, whatever we're doing, it is not finished. It hasn't started properly yet, and I'm not willing to let it end before it does." He was very still, the way he went still when he was processing something at the deepest level. "I have to be honest with you," he said, "about what I want." "Then be honest. I want to marry you." He said it the same way he said everything. Plain, unadorned, just the truth set down on the table between them. "I want you and your children to come to this ranch, and I want to build something here that's bigger than either of us has managed alone. I want Luca to learn the land. I want the twins to grow up with space to run. I want Cora to stop being cold." A beat. "I want to stop living in this house by myself." The last sentence had something in it that the others didn't. Something more exposed, less composed. The admission inside the admission. She looked at him for a long time. "You said that like you're expecting me to say no," she said. "I think you might." "Why?" "Because it's fast, and because I have a grazing lease problem, and because the settlement will—" "Garrick," she said, "stop building my objections for me." He stopped. "I have my own objections," she said. "Some of them are real. You want to hear them?" "Yes?" She took her hand back from his chest and sat down again, because this was going to be a real conversation, and she needed to think clearly. He sat too. "My children have already lost one father," she said. "Luca especially. He's attached to you in a way he doesn't fully understand yet. If this doesn't work, if we do this and something goes wrong, the damage is not just to me. It's to 4 people who have already taken more losses than they should have." "I know that. You don't know what that looks like from inside. A 12-year-old boy the morning after his father died. The way—" She stopped, steadied. "You need to understand that this is not just about you and me." "I understand that," he said, and the flatness of his voice was entirely absent now, replaced by something more careful and genuine. "I have understood that since the first morning I sat at your table and watched Luca decide whether to trust me. I'm not asking to replace Thomas. I'm not asking to be something I can't be. I'm asking to be here, consistently, with whatever that means." Selene looked at him. This man who had driven through a blizzard, who had sold his father's watch, who had stood in front of Fletcher Borgett twice and forced the truth out into the open both times, who had given a 12-year-old boy a surveying manual because the boy had asked good questions about a map. "The children would need to agree," she said, "not just be told." "Of course." "Luca especially. If Luca says no, that matters." "It matters to me too," Garrick said. "I wouldn't want it any other way." She looked at the table's surface. Old pine, scarred from years of use, coffee rings and knife marks. Very different from Thomas's table. Thomas's table was in a cabin a mile and a half from here, in a settlement that had decided what she was worth and had been wrong about it for years. "The grazing lease," she said. "I'll handle it." "How?" "There are other options. I've been managing Borgett's goodwill for 15 years because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative involves some legal work and some negotiation with the Territory Land Office, and it's manageable." He said it with the flat confidence of a man who'd been letting something be someone else's problem and had decided to stop. "I let Owen have more leverage than he earned because I didn't want the friction. That's done." Selene was quiet for a moment. "He's going to make trouble." "He was going to make trouble regardless. That's who he is. He met her eyes. The question isn't whether Owen Bourget makes trouble. The question is whether we let him decide what we do. She heard the we in that sentence. It landed differently than the word usually did. Heavier, more specific. I need to talk to the children, she said. Yes. Tonight, when I get back. Yes. And then I need a few days. She looked at him. Not because I don't know what I want, but because I need to do this right. Not fast, not in a panic, not because the alternative scared me. I want to decide when I'm sure. Take whatever time you need, he said. And you're not going anywhere, she said. Not a question. No, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She stood and put her coat back on, and he walked her out to the porch. The winter afternoon was half gone, the light going sideways and thin across the valley, and the mountains were dark blue against the pale sky. She could see from the ranch porch a stretch of the valley she'd never seen from this angle, the whole long sweep of it, the snow-covered floor and the timber stands, and somewhere in the far distance the dark smudge that was the settlement. From here it looked very small. The watch, she said. Your father's. It's gone, he said. It's just a thing. It wasn't just a thing. He was quiet for a moment. No, he said. It wasn't. She started down the porch steps, then stopped and turned back. What was his name? Your father. He looked slightly surprised, not by the question, but maybe by the timing of it, or the fact that she'd thought to ask. Edmund, he said. Edmund Boone. He raised a son who drove through a blizzard to bring flour to a woman he'd never properly met, she said. I think Edmund Boone would have been fine with the watch. She walked away before she could see his face change, because she thought it might, and she didn't want to manage her own reaction to it right now. She had 4 children to go home to, and a conversation to figure out how to have, and several days of thinking ahead of her, and she needed to be clear for all of it. The walk home was colder than the walk out. The temperature dropped fast once the sun started going down, and the road was harder underfoot now, and her breath came in steady, visible clouds. But she walked faster on the way back than she had on the way out, which told her something about the direction things were moving. She got home as the last light was dying. The twins were at the table arguing about something involving a piece of rope and a knot that had gone wrong. Cora was asleep in her chair by the fire, which she wasn't supposed to do but did anyway with the committed regularity of someone who knows they'll be forgiven. Luca was reading the surveying manual at the far end of the table with a stub of pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table and said, I need to talk to all 4 of you about something important. Can you wake your sister? Luca looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face told him enough that his expression went careful and very still. Then he got up and went to Cora and shook her gently by the shoulder. The twins stopped arguing. 4 children, 4 faces, arranged in the firelight, looking at her. She looked at them, all of them, one at a time, taking each face in. Eli with his perpetual energy slightly dimmed by curiosity. Sam leaning forward on his elbows. Cora blinking sleep from her eyes and sensing, with the animal awareness of young children, that something significant was happening. And Luca, upright and watchful, who had already made a guess and was waiting to see if he was right. I need to tell you about something Mr. Boone asked me, she said. And I need to know what you think. All of you. The room was quiet. Outside, the wind found the eaves. He wants us to come to his ranch, she said, to live there, permanently. He wants to marry me and build a life with our family. She kept her voice steady. This is not decided. Nothing is decided, but I won't decide it without hearing from you. Silence. Then Sam said, Does that mean we'd get to see the horse? The opinionated one. Selene almost laughed. She kept it together. Jeremiah, she said. Yes. Oh, good, Sam said with the utter sincerity of 8. Eli punched him in the shoulder. That's not the important part. It's an important part. Boys, Selene said. They stopped. She looked at Cora, who was sitting with her doll pressed against her chest, and her thumb almost in her mouth, and her eyes very large. What do you think, sweetheart? Selene asked. Cora looked at her, then at her thumb. Then she lowered it deliberately and said, Would Mr. Boone be our father? He would be your stepfather, Selene said. He can't replace your father. Nobody can. But he'd be there. Every day. He'd take care of us. Cora considered this with great seriousness. He already takes care of us, she said. Yes, Selene said. He does. Then yes, Cora said, as though it were simple, and put her thumb back in her mouth. Selene looked at Luca. He was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the surveying manual. She waited. He sold his watch, Luca said finally. His father's watch. For Christmas. Selene stared at him. He told me, Luca said, last week when we were doing the guide rope. He wasn't going to, I don't think. It just came out. He looked up. His eyes were Thomas's eyes, that specific dark brown, and right now they were very clear. I asked him why he came, and he said because he couldn't watch and do nothing, and then he told me about the watch. Selene sat very still. He didn't tell me so I'd feel bad, Luca said. He told me because I asked an honest question, and he gave me an honest answer. He paused. That's what I want. For you. For us. His voice was careful, but it wasn't composed. It was the voice of a boy working very hard at something. Papa was good, Mama. He loved us. But things were hard because he couldn't. He stopped. Tried again. Mr. Boone fixes what's broken. The fire popped. Selene looked at her eldest child and felt something she didn't have a name for move through her. Grief and gratitude and the particular ache of watching a child be wiser than they should have to be. Is that a yes? She asked. Luca picked up his pencil from behind his ear and turned it over in his fingers. It's a yes, he said. She nodded. She needed a moment before she said anything else, and she took it. Then she looked at all four of them. All right, she said. Give me a few days, and then we'll tell him together. She gave herself 3 days, as she'd said she would. Not because she was uncertain. She'd known what she was going to say before she'd walked back through her own door that evening, before Luca had told her about the watch, before Cora had said he already takes care of us with the devastating simplicity of someone who hadn't yet learned to complicate true things. She'd known on the walk home when she'd noticed herself moving faster on the return than she had on the way out. But she'd promised herself she would decide from stillness and not from momentum, and she kept that promise. The 3 days were quiet, in the way that days are quiet when something large is being processed underneath them. The surface of things normal and ordinary, the children and the meals and the fire. While somewhere below that surface, something was settling into place like a beam going into a wall. She thought about Thomas. She did this without guilt, which itself told her something, that enough time had passed, or maybe that what she was moving toward wasn't a replacement of what she'd had, but a different thing entirely, built on different ground. Thomas had been the love of her youth. He'd been the man she'd crossed an ocean for, and she'd never regretted that, not even in the hardest years, because he had been genuine in the ways that counted, even when he failed in the practical ones. She could carry Thomas and still move forward. She understood this now in a way she hadn't 6 months ago. She thought about Garrick, about the specificity of who he was, not a romantic notion of him, not the idea of rescue or relief, but the actual man. His flat delivery and his careful hands and the way he spoke to her children with the exact same honesty he used with adults. His inability to perform. The watch. The 4 trips in the dark on Christmas night. The fact that he'd told her he was scared and dressed it up as consideration, and then had not defended himself when she'd named it. A man who couldn't argue with the truth even when the truth was inconvenient for him was a rare thing. She'd met very few of them. On the 3rd evening, she sat down and wrote a letter. Not to Garrick, but to herself, which was something she'd done occasionally since girlhood when she needed to think clearly. She wrote in her first language, the one she dreamed in, the one that still arrived fastest when she was tired or overwhelmed. She wrote what she was afraid of, and what she wanted, and what she believed, and when she was done, she folded it and put it in the stove and watched it burn because it had served its purpose. Then she called the children together and said, "Tomorrow morning, all of us." Luca looked at her. "We're going to his ranch?" "We're going to tell him yes," she said. The twins celebrated this with their entire bodies. Cora asked if she could bring her doll. Luca said nothing, just picked up his surveying manual and went back to reading. But the set of his shoulders was different, loosened somehow, released from something he'd been holding. They left in the morning before the light was fully up. Selene hitched the small wagon. the one Thomas had bought in better years and that she'd maintained through worse ones, which was a minor mechanical miracle, and loaded the children in the back with blankets, and they moved through the cold valley with the slow, determined pace of a draft horse named Abner, who had no opinions about anything and was therefore the precise opposite of Jeremiah. The mountains were pink at the tops when they came down the track to Garrick's ranch. The smoke from the chimneys was already going. The same dog appeared and barked twice and sat down. Everything exactly as it had been 3 days ago, and entirely different. Garrick came out onto the porch before they reached it. He'd heard the wagon, and he stood there in the early light, looking at 5 people coming toward him instead of 1. And Selene watched something move across his face that he didn't manage to contain in time. It was the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. Just for a moment. Just the raw fact of them, all 5, coming up his track in the cold morning. He came down the porch steps. The twins were out of the wagon before it stopped, which was probably a safety concern she should address at some point. They hit the ground running and went straight to him, and he caught Sam by the collar before he could run past into the yard, and Eli skidded to a stop, and both of them started talking simultaneously about the horse, Jeremiah, and where was he, and could they see him, and was he in the barn? "He's in the barn," Garrick said, and the twins were gone. Cora climbed down with her doll and looked up at him with large, serious eyes and said, "We came to tell you something." "I gathered," he said. "Mama has to say it," Cora said, with the gravity of someone who has been assigned a role in a proceeding. "But I can tell you that I said yes." "Thank you, Cora," he said. Cora nodded and went to find the twins. Luca had gotten down from the wagon and was standing near the wheel, not crowding the conversation, but present. He and Garrick looked at each other with the particular quality they had, 2 people who'd already done the difficult talking, who knew where they stood. Garrick offered his hand. Luca shook it. Properly, the way he'd clearly been practicing. Firm, brief, a man's handshake. Garrick didn't make anything of it, just shook it back and let it go. "The south pasture fence has a section that needs resetting before spring," Garrick said to him. "I could use someone who understands the survey lines." Luca almost smiled. "I've been reading the chapter on boundary marking." "I know," Garrick said. "I saw your notes." Luca looked at him. "You looked at my notes?" "You left the book at the table last week. I saw the margin notes." He paused. "Your calculations on the north property line were right." Luca stood a little straighter, trying not to show what that cost him in composure. He mostly succeeded. "I'll look at the south pasture," he said, and went to find his siblings with the deliberate casual pace of someone who doesn't want anyone to see how fast they actually want to move. And then it was just Selene and Garrick, standing in the cold morning light in front of his ranch house, with the mountains behind it, and the smoke going from both chimneys, and the sound of 3 children discovering an opinionated horse somewhere inside the barn, punctuated by what was either excitement or the horse having feelings about it. She looked at him. He looked back. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, slow, controlled, but she heard it. One full breath let out, like something he'd been holding for days. "Yes," she said again, "all 4 of us. Together. If you still want it." "I still want it," he said, and his voice was lower than usual, stripped of its customary flatness, just the plain truth of the man underneath. She crossed the distance between them, and he met her halfway, which felt right. No one waiting for the other, both moving. She put her hand against his jaw, his cold, rough jaw, and he put both hands around hers, careful and warm, and they stood like that in the thin morning light, while somewhere in the barn a horse expressed an opinion loudly, and a child laughed. He pressed his forehead to hers. "We're going to have trouble," she said quietly. "I know. Owen Bourget won't let this go easily." "No, he won't. The settlement is going to, Selene." He pulled back just enough to look at her face. "Let's solve the problems when they get here." She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded. They were married on a Thursday in late February, 23 days after that morning in the cold, which felt both fast and like the natural conclusion of something that had actually started in November when a man drove past a failing crop and couldn't stop thinking about it. The ceremony was in the ranch, performed by a circuit judge named Warren Aldis, who was a practical man with no aesthetic opinions about weddings and who worked through the legal language with the brisk efficiency of someone who had other stops on his route. Vera Hallstrom came. She arrived an hour early and immediately took over the kitchen, which nobody argued with. Daniel Thorpe came with his wife. A cowhands named Reese, who'd worked Garrick's ranch for 2 years and was the closest thing Garrick had to a consistent friend, stood at the back of the room and looked uncomfortable in a clean shirt. The settlement was not invited because the settlement had not earned it. Selene felt no guilt about this. She wore the dark green wool dress she'd made herself because it fit and because it was hers and because she wasn't going to perform anything for anyone. Garrick wore his better coat and a clean shirt and looked exactly like himself, which was all she'd wanted. Luca stood beside her during the vows with his arms at his sides and his face very serious. The twins had been instructed to remain still for 10 minutes, which they managed for approximately 7 before Eli leaned over and said something to Sam that made Sam shake with suppressed laughter, and Garrick glanced at them and said, very quietly, 3 more minutes, and they pulled themselves together with visible effort. Cora held her doll and watched everything with enormous eyes, and when the judge said the final words and it was done, she walked over to Garrick and took his hand without asking and just held it, and he looked down at her and something in his face went very still and very open in the way it only did when he was caught off guard by something he felt deeply. Vera served food that was better than anything the settlement's gatherings had produced in living memory, and they ate at the long table in the ranch house with actual warmth and actual noise and the particular quality of celebration that happens when the people present have genuinely chosen to be there. Reese, after enough coffee, turned out to have an unexpectedly dry sense of humor that the twins found hilarious. Daniel Thorpe's wife talked to Selene about the spring planting schedule with the matter-of-fact friendliness of someone who'd decided to treat her as a neighbor and intended to keep doing so. Luca and Garrick sat at one end of the table with the survey map spread between the food, which Vera disapproved of loudly and they ignored entirely. It was not a perfect day. The stove in the East Room decided to smoke badly right in the middle of dinner, and Garrick had to deal with it while the food got cold and said 2 words that Selene made a mental note to discuss at some point. Cora spilled her drink and cried about it with a completeness that suggested it wasn't really about the drink. One of Reese's anecdotes went on about 15 minutes too long and nobody knew how to stop it. The judge left before dessert because of the route. None of it mattered. None of it came close to mattering. Owen Borget's response arrived, formally, 11 days after the wedding. A letter delivered through the Territory Land Office that outlined his family's historical claim to the grazing corridor and the terms under which he would consider its continued use. It was lawyerly and careful, and designed to look like paperwork while functioning as a threat. Garrick read it at the breakfast table while Selene was making porridge and the twins were doing something inadvisable in the yard. He set it down and drank his coffee. "Well," she said, "he's retained someone from Billings, which means he's spending actual money on this." He turned the letter over in his hand. That means he's serious, but it also means he's committed. Once you've paid a lawyer, you don't back down easily. "Can we fight it? We can do better than fight it." He looked up. "I had a conversation with the Territory Land Office 2 weeks ago, before the wedding. There's a survey discrepancy in the original Bourget claim. The boundary line was drawn based on a landmark that no longer exists. If the survey is reopened, the corridor almost certainly reverts to open range, which removes his leverage entirely." Selene looked at him. "You knew about this before he sent the letter." "I suspected. I confirmed it last week. And you didn't tell me." "I was waiting until I was certain." She picked up the letter and read it herself. Then she set it down. "Write back," she said. "Tell him we've requested a survey review." Garrick was already reaching for paper. The legal matter took 4 months to fully resolve, during which Owen Bourget made 2 more attempts to apply pressure, once through Martha Bourget's campaign of social commentary that filtered through the settlement's female networks, and once through a conversation with Luca's school teacher, Aldous Peck, that resulted in Luca coming home one afternoon with a written note from Peck suggesting that his attendance was becoming disruptive to the other students, which was so transparent as to be almost insulting. Selene read the note at the kitchen table. Then she looked at Luca. "Are you disrupting anything?" she said. "No," Luca said. "Is your work current?" "I finished the geography primer. Mr. Peck doesn't have anything else for me at that level." Selene set the note down. "I'm going to write back to Mr. Peck," she said, "and I'm going to suggest that if the school can't accommodate a student who has outpaced its curriculum, then perhaps the Territory Education Board would be interested in funding a more advanced curriculum for the Dalton settlement, since the Territory is very interested in appearing progressive about education right now. Luca looked at her with an expression that was purely his father's, that specific, surprised but delighted look that Thomas had made when she'd done something he hadn't anticipated. "Do you know someone at the Territory Education Board?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "But Daniel Thorpe's brother-in-law works in the Territory Administrator's office, and Daniel has been very friendly." She wrote the letter. Peck did not write back. The issue did not come up again. The survey review concluded in June. The corridor reverted to open range. Owen Bourget's lawyer sent a final letter that said very little in a great many words. Garrick filed the resolution paperwork and set it on the shelf and never mentioned Owen Bourget again, and as far as Selene could tell, never thought about him much either. This was one of the things she was still learning about Garrick Boone. Once a problem was solved, he released it with a thoroughness she found both admirable and slightly unnatural, having spent most of her life carrying resolved problems as preventative weight against future ones. She was working on it. Spring came to the ranch with the same blunt announcement it always made in Montana. Not a gentle warming, but a sudden aggressive thaw that turned everything to mud for 3 weeks before the real growing season arrived. The twins discovered that the mud had no particular depth limit and had to be extracted from it twice. Cora developed an intense relationship with one of the ranch dogs, a gray mutt named Porter, who followed her everywhere with the devoted resignation of someone who has accepted their life's purpose. Luca spent his afternoons in the south pasture with Garrick, resetting the fence line according to the survey markers, and came home each evening with dirt on his boots, and the particular quiet satisfaction of someone who has done real work and knows it. Selene planted a kitchen garden on the south-facing slope below the ranch house, where the soil was deep and the drainage was good. She planted what she knew: beets, potatoes, onions, the herbs she'd been growing in containers inside all winter. Garrick watched her lay it out one morning from the porch without saying anything until she'd finished, and then said, "You could take the whole slope if you want it. I've never done anything with it." She looked at the slope, the whole thing, 3 times what she'd been planning. "That's more than I can manage alone," she said. "You won't be alone," he said. She took the whole slope. By late spring, the garden was in and growing with the stubborn persistence of things that have been properly tended, and the cattle were on the spring pasture, and the ranch house had undergone a series of changes that were not dramatic but were cumulative. A row of boots by the door, the twins' drawings pinned to the wall in the main room, Cora's doll on a shelf in the kitchen where Cora could see it from the table, Luca's surveying manual, and a growing collection of notes in a notebook he'd started filling with measurements and observations about the property. The house had stopped smelling like one person. The settlement's attitude shifted in the way that settlement attitudes do when faced with the irreversibility of facts, not warmly, not into acceptance, but into a kind of grudging acknowledgement that a situation exists and persists and is not going to be argued out of existence by continued disapproval. Martha Bourget still had a particular expression she deployed when she saw Selene, but she deployed it less frequently, because Selene came into the settlement less frequently and with less deference when she did. Clara Harding had twice stopped to talk to her with something that was approaching genuine interest, asking about the garden, which Clara was apparently trying to start herself with mixed results. Daniel Thorpe and his wife had come to dinner at the ranch in April and come back in May, and there was talk of something more regular, the kind of talk that meant it would actually happen. It was not acceptance by the settlement. Selene had stopped waiting for that, had stopped locating her worth in whether it arrived. What it was a life. A real one, lived on its own terms on their own land, and the settlement could adjust or not according to its own pace. One evening in July, a long, warm evening with the light lasting until almost 9 and the valley lit gold from the west, Selene was sitting on the porch with her coffee while the children finished the last of their chores. Garrick came out and sat in the other chair, which had been there since April, positioned where it was because 2 people sat here now, and not one. They sat in the comfortable silence that had developed between them over months. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who don't need to fill air in order to feel connected. It had taken her a long time to learn to trust that kind of quiet with another person. She was learning it. Down in the yard, Eli was trying to teach Porter the dog a trick that Porter had no interest in learning. Cora was watching with her arms crossed, offering critique. Sam had climbed something he wasn't supposed to climb and was calling for someone to observe how high he was. "Sam?" Garrick said, not raising his voice much. "Yeah? Get down." "I'm fine." "I know. Get down anyway." A pause. Then the sounds of Sam getting down, which involved more drama than the height strictly warranted. Selene looked at the mountains, blue and enormous in the evening light, the snow still on the high peaks, the lower slopes green now with the short, violent summer. "I've been thinking about something," she said. Garrick looked at her. "About December," she said. "About what I was thinking that night, before you knocked." He waited. "I was watching the fire go down and I was doing the math on the flour, and I was—" She stopped, found the honest version. "I wasn't thinking about dying. I wasn't that far. But I was thinking about what it meant if I couldn't solve it, if I couldn't make it work one more time. I was thinking about what that would look like, and I was very tired, and the fire was going, and I thought—" She looked at her coffee cup. "I thought maybe the town was right. Maybe we were what they said we were, people who couldn't make it here, who didn't belong." Garrick said nothing. She could feel him listening. "And then you knocked," she said. The evening air moved gently across the porch. Porter had given up on the trick and was lying in the yard with his chin on his paws, watching Cora with devotion. "I know you think of it as just doing the right thing," she said. "I know that's how it felt to you. Something obvious that needed doing, and you did it." "Something like that," he said. "I want you to know that it wasn't small," she said. "What it was, on my side of the door. It wasn't small." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over without looking at her and put his hand over hers where it rested on the chair arm. His hand was rough and warm and certain, the same as it always was. "I know," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that while the light went gold and then amber and then the long, slow blue of a Montana summer evening settling in, and the children's voices moved around the yard below the porch, and somewhere in the distance, the cattle were lowing with the low, mindless contentment of animals that have been well fed and have no concept of how close things had come to being otherwise. It hadn't been the love she'd had at 20. That particular kind of love was what it was, urgent and certain, and built on a foundation of youth and possibility and the ocean between one life and another. This was something built differently, slower and harder, out of a winter and a knock on a door and 4 trips in the dark, and a man who couldn't watch and do nothing. Out of a woman who'd almost decided the town was right and then opened the door with a knife in her hand. Not a clean story. Not a smooth one. 2 people with loss behind them and imperfect histories and no particular guarantee of what came next, choosing each other in the specific and unglamorous way that real choices get made. Not in one grand moment, but in accumulation, in the day-by-day decision to show up, to be honest, to not leave when things got difficult. There was a lesson in it, though Selene wasn't the type to summarize such things out loud. What she understood, sitting on this porch in this light, was something about the particular cruelty of silence, the way a community could make a person invisible over time, so gradually and so thoroughly that they began to cooperate with their own invisibility, to shrink into the space assigned to them and call it survival. She'd been doing that, doing it long enough that she'd stopped noticing the shrinking. What Garrick had done, knocking on that door, wasn't just about flour and firewood. It was someone refusing to let her be invisible, someone saying, without using those words, "I see you specifically, and specifically you are worth the drive." She thought about women who never got that knock, who sat by dying fires and believed what the town told them about their own worth, and were still sitting there, invisible, waiting for a permission that was never coming. She thought about this, and felt something that was somewhere between sorrow and fury, and promised herself quietly and without ceremony that she would not forget what it had felt like, so that when she had the opportunity to knock on someone else's door, she would not talk herself out of it. Garrick's thumb moved slightly against her hand, the way it did sometimes, absent and habitual, and she felt it like a pulse. "Luca asked me today," he said, "whether he could help with the fall roundup." Selene looked at him. "He's 12. He's almost 13, and he's been reading the management manuals." Garrick paused. "He also said, and I'm quoting, that his mother would probably say he's too young, but that he'd like me to make the case." Selene was quiet for a moment. Then, "He asked you to make the case." "He did. He went around me." "He did." She thought about the specific tactics of 12-year-old boys who have learned the terrain of their family. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd mention it," Garrick said, "and that what you said went." She looked at her coffee cup, looked at the yard where Luca was now leaning on the fence, watching the pasture with the focused, measuring look he got when he was thinking about the land. 12 years old, Thomas's eyes. Her stubbornness and her late husband's hunger for possibility, and something that was entirely his own, some quality of steadiness and precision that Selene suspected might belong to a version of himself that hadn't existed before this winter, that had been built by things she couldn't have given him alone. "Tell him we'll discuss it," she said. "That's close to a yes." "It's close to a discussion," she said, but she was almost smiling. The last of the light went from gold to gray above the mountains, and the first star appeared in the eastern sky, early and bright. And below the porch, Porter stood and shook himself, and wandered toward the barn with the sense of purpose that dogs develop around dinner time. And Cora followed him automatically, and the twins came up the porch steps arguing about something that would not be resolved tonight, or possibly ever. And Luca came last, slowly, looking at the survey notes in his hand, and the ranch house filled back up with the noise of 5 people ending their day inside it. Garrick got up to start dinner, which he'd taken over on Tuesdays and Thursdays with the same unilateral decisiveness he'd applied to everything else. And the fact that his cooking was functional rather than good was something Selene had decided to address gradually and not all at once. He moved through the kitchen with his particular economy of motion, and the twins immediately began trying to help in ways that complicated rather than assisted. And Cora climbed onto the counter to supervise from above, which was not allowed and happened anyway. Selene stood in the doorway between the porch and the main room and watched all of it. The cabin they'd left was a mile and a half down the valley. She'd been back twice to collect things, and the second time she'd stood inside the empty room and looked at the fireplace where the fire had almost gone out on Christmas night. And she'd felt the distance between that woman and this one, not a huge distance in time, barely half a year, but measured in other units it was considerable. Measured in what she'd allowed herself to want. Measured in doors open with a knife in hand that turned out to lead somewhere worth going. The settlement was still there. Owen Bourget was still there, recalculated and quieted, but not changed. The Whispers would recalibrate and find new things to work with, because that's what Whispers did. The world didn't transform because 2 people decided to be stubborn about their own worth. It just continued, with them in it differently, occupying more of the space that was actually theirs. That was enough. More than enough.
Mama,
Cora called from the counter she wasn't supposed to be on. Porter scratched the door again. "Get down from there," Selene said, and came inside and let the door close behind her against the summer dark. The fire in the grate was high and warm and not going anywhere. Outside, the Montana highlands lay under a sky full of stars, and the garden was growing on the south slope, and the cattle were on the summer pasture, and the fence line was straight and properly surveyed, and somewhere in the barn Jeremiah had opinions about the evening that no one had asked for. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. But it was theirs. All of it. The noise and the mud and the difficult neighbors and the opinionated horse and the Tuesday dinners that needed improvement and the 12-year-old who went around his mother and the 7-year-old on the counter and the twins who couldn't stop arguing said, all of it, fully and without apology, theirs. And that, in the end, was the only kind of kingdom worth building.